Everyone, my name is Jamie, and today I'm going to be taking a look at an episode of the podcast Low Society that makes some pretty bad faith and incorrect arguments about aromantic people and why being aromantic is not a valid identity. But before we get started, I want to state that I am asexual, but I am not aromantic. I still wanted to respond, though, both to educate people about aromanticism and asexuality, and because most of the arguments in this podcast are frequently used against asexual people as well. A lot of the ideas that Peter Coffin and the other podcast hosts espouse in this episode are actively harmful, and it's important that people know not only that they are wrong and damaging, but why. That being said, the episode does suggest both implicitly and explicitly that aromantic people are mentally ill, that they should effectively undergo conversion therapy, and that they are not a valid romantic identity. If any of these topics will be triggering for you, please stop here. They will show up a lot. So without further ado, let's get to the podcast. So the meat of this episode starts out with them playing a video clip that they found on Twitter of somebody making a video about basic information about aromantic people for Aro Week, which happened a couple of months ago. So we're going to listen to that and then see how they respond to it.
Hey guys, I'm Yasmin Benoit, and I'm teaming up with Stonewall for Aromantic Spectrum Awareness Week to give you some tips on how to be an Aro ally. For starters, educate yourself about what being aromantic means. There's a lot of resources online. Learn to value different forms of love equally. Platonic love matters too, and it's just as important as romantic love. Don't impose your own ideas or stereotypes. Being aromantic is not the same as just being single, being unlovable, incapable of love, not finding the right person yet, or having some kind of issue. We don't need to hear that. Be considerate of the way you talk about romance. When you frame it as being this ultimate life goal or something fundamental to human connection, then that can be very alienating for aromantic people. Stand up for the aromantic community and call out discrimination. There's a lot of anti-aro attitudes out there, and we need people to be vocal.
Absolutely.
Amplify aromantic voices. It's Aro Week. Share this.
That was pretty good. It had some pretty good information about, didn't really talk about what being aromantic is, but I had some pretty good information about, not treating romantic love as the only kind of love or the most important kind of love and all that. So I thought it was pretty good, but let's hear what they have to say about it.
The whole Stonewall riot thing was people being brutalized by society and the police because they were romantic. It perplexed me because a lot of these people were saying, that the aromantic people are oppressed in the same way, or have.
I don't understand the impulse to try to compare and play this oppression Olympics game that yes, of course, gay people and trans people were and are harassed for who they do love. But as the person pointed out in that video clip, aromantic people and asexual people, while not facing the same kind of overt harassment, can still face a lot of harassment and discrimination and just really toxic messaging from society and from their families about what they should be doing, or messaging that they are, wrong, or that there's something wrong with them for not wanting to be in that kind of relationship. So it's not the same thing, but there are issues there that need to be addressed.
Their oppression, quote unquote, has a similar correlation between other forms of LGBT oppression.
There was a really good tweet. It said, "Is there an aromantic bar you have to go to avoid getting killed?"
Does having a bar, is that what makes an LGBTQ identity valid? Is having a specific bar for it? I feel like that's really weird. Also a lot of, obviously there are still gay bars, but in my experience, a lot of queer spaces are queer spaces for all sorts of LGBTQ plus people, and you don't just have to be a gay man to go into a gay bar.
Well, yeah.
Well, it's also you when you go to question them and say, what is the oppression that you suffer from being aromantic? They then go, you questioned me. That's fucking violence.
Yeah.
How dare you?
It's literal violence.
Yeah, it's literal. But I bet you.
I mean, no, again, The person said in the little audio clip, and I continue to say and do say to anybody who brings up this argument, that the oppression is the constant messaging and idea and cultural norm and value and all of the like benefits associated with it of having a heteronormative, monogamous, sexual and romantic relationship with one other person, and then that's the thing that you ought to be striving for throughout your entire adult life. That is the thing that aromantic people and asexual people are like, this is wrong, and the fact that it's so normative that asexual or aromantic people's parents will like take them to the doctor when they come out and say like, I think my child has some sort of something wrong with them because they don't want to have a sexual relationship, or they don't want to have a romantic relationship. Again, that's the kind of oppression we're talking about, and they're just straw manning and saying like, oh, everybody's just going to react like they're angry at us. But also, if they've tried to explain it to you several times and you keep being like, well, you're not oppressed, then of course they're going to get angry.
But the mode in and of itself does operate narcissistically. That's not to say that aromantic people are narcissists, but this notion of, here's the identity that I'm putting forward, and you need to validate me. You need to give me validation. You need to prioritize me in your speech. You need to sort of change the way that you interact with or view certain concepts. And it puts a lot of people on their heckles. And
this keeps coming up, this kind of argument that it is narcissistic to expect people to be accommodating of aromantic people. I find it interesting that it keeps coming up because it's actually the exact same argument that transphobes will make about trans people. And I find it interesting. Later, Peter will espouse it as well, and they identify as non-binary. And so I find it very interesting coming from them, because it's the same argument as a lot of people will say, like, you're policing my speech, you're making me use a specific pronoun for you, like, you are, and people will get upset about that because they're transphobic and don't want to make basic accommodations for trans people. So I don't understand why this argument keeps coming from a group of people who most of them do identify as some sort of LGBTQ+, and Peter identifies as non-binary, and like should understand that there are some basic accommodations in language that people should expect just by virtue of being a human and treated with respect. And similarly, aromantic people are not asking for that much. It's just, maybe don't speak to people as though they ought to be striving for a romantic relationship, or as though that is the like ultimate form of relationship that one experiences in their life. Like, that's not asking for a lot. And them reacting like this is, in my brain, very similar to people reacting like, oh, I'm not gonna call a trans woman she. It's ridiculous.
And if they think it is, well, then they're going about it the entirely wrong way.
I'm sure.
But this is the same argument of like, why are gay people going about this? Why are they flaunting it in people's faces? That's the wrong way to go about it. They should just be like living their normal lives like everybody else, and not flaunting it in people's faces, not making demands of people. Like, it's the same like be a good gay argument, and I'm tired of it, and I don't know why a bunch of queer people are making the same argument.
That there are people that non-cynically believe that this is an important identity category to have. That's just, it's like making eating anchovies an identity category. Like, you're just doing something that like some people might think is vaguely different.
It's like saying I don't like pineapple on pizza, and so I am oppressed.
Or
no, it's not. I don't think that I should have to explain this, but for those of you who may be confused, being aromantic is not a preference or a choice. It is a thing that you are. Same thing for being asexual, same thing for being any LGBTQ identity. It is not, oh, I like this kind of food or I don't like this kind of food. It's like, I don't experience this kind of attraction that other people do, that the majority of other people do, that I am expected to, that society caters to people who do experience that kind of attraction and I don't. That's not the same thing, I think, pretty self-evidently as, oh, I do or don't like pineapple on pizza.
I have life-threatening allergies, for instance, and I go to restaurants and bars or wherever the fuck, and sometimes they put nuts in stuff. But I also understand that my health is my responsibility, so I make sure that I ask, or I tell the waiter, or I tell the server about what my allergies are. I don't expect everybody to, or if I go to a barbecue at a friend's house, or if I go to Jake's parents' house or whatever, I'm not like, oh my God, you're trying to murder me because you made tiramisu with like cashews.
First of all, yes, at a restaurant, you definitely should ask and like tell the waiter, I have an allergy to X, and then hopefully the restaurant will make accommodations. But that's sort of a similar thing. First of all, your romanticism is not going to be coming up at a restaurant most likely, so it's not a very one-to-one comparison. But if you think about what would be a one-to-one comparison, which would be like a transgender person going to a restaurant and saying, like, correcting the wait staff or whatever and saying, please refer to me by she, her pronouns or whatever. Like, the expectation after that first encounter is on the other person or the establishment to then make that accommodation, which is where I see their analogy breaking down. Like, of course, after you tell the restaurant I'm allergic to cashews, if they bring you out something with cashews, you would be right to get angry at them. Similarly, if you're going to somebody's house who you've been to their house several times to eat food, and you've told them several times that you're allergic to cashews, and they bring you out something with cashews in it, I would be angry at them. Similarly to if you're a trans person and you tell a friend repeatedly that they should refer to you by a certain set of pronouns and they continue to not, you are justified in being angry at them. And similarly for this case, if an aromantic person, if you continue to pressure an aromantic person about getting into a romantic relationship, or ask them about if they are going to get into a romantic relationship after they've told you that they are not interested, and you continue to do that, I think this is the key. If you continue to do that, then that person is justified in being angry at you.
Aromanticism, like, I'm not saying that, like, you have to be in a romantic relationship or anything. This is definitely a non-cynical application of that. But, like, to identify as aromantic, to literally shape who you are around the idea that you don't have romantic relationships is absolutely and totally absurd. It is
and unhealthy.
Yeah, it's very
Oh boy, okay, so they're going to get into some of the really problematic assertions that aromantic people are unhealthy or ill in some way, and I just kind of want to head it off by saying, no, they're not. And the whole shaping your identity around being aromantic, like, again, how is this different from homophobes or transphobes saying, like, you're shaping your identity around being attracted to men or being attracted to women or being a man or being a woman? First of all, it is not the entirety of any aromantic person's identity. I know several aromantic people, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, not that this should be a question, but it's certainly only one part of who that person is. But it also does interact with a lot of facets of who someone is and what they want to do and who they become as they grow older. Because I think I would not be incorrect in saying that people who are not aromantic, their romantic relationships do shape who they are, and their desire to be in a romantic relationship shapes some of their behavior, like dating. And then once they're in a romantic relationship, like, that kind of intimate relationship shapes a lot of things about you. And so not wanting to do that, or that's the wrong way of saying it, right? Not experiencing that kind of attraction and therefore not dating people or getting into romantic relationships with people will, by virtue of you not being in that kind of relationship, shape parts of your identity and parts of what you want to do with your life.
I'm sorry, that is such a small aspect of your life. If there's no if that's not there, it's the tiniest aspect of your life.
But
Why are you identifying as a lack of a thing that, like, in theory, the thing that you're talking about, quote unquote, having is like just avoiding doing a thing.
But
It's not just avoiding doing a thing, it's not experiencing a thing. You're, like I said, you are shaped not only by the things you do, but by the things that you don't do, by the things that you experience, and by the things that you don't experience. And in a culture where most people are strongly expected to experience monogamous romantic relationships, not experiencing that is going to shape your experience.
major sort of thing that they sort of put, like, you know, a lot of emphasis on is the fact that our culture has a high emphasis on romance and pairing. But I'm like, that's the way that people have, you know, it's so vital to human reproduction, like pair bonding, not just in terms of like progeny and children, but in terms of like, you know, making life happen and stuff. It's what we've done for like thousands of years as human beings. So of course in our culture there's going to be an emphasis on pair bonding and romance, but that doesn't mean that if you don't want to do that, then that makes you abnormal or weird.
Oh my god. I mean, that's the exact same argument that people have used. Like, gay relationships aren't legitimate because the way that humans reproduce is between a man and a woman, and that's how it's been since humans have existed, and therefore it's unnatural for a man to be in a relationship with a man or a woman to be in a relationship with a woman because you can't reproduce that way. Like, that's the same argument, and it's so dumb. Like, just because something is a biological fact, like how reproduction works, doesn't mean that has to dictate anything about what individual people do or experience.
Also, there's stuff that you're naturally not going to be able to relate to as well, because romance, sex, and love are inherently exclusionary. They're never going to be inclusive. And there's no way that you can talk about romance and love that's going to be totally inclusive. Of course, there are universal things about romance and love that we all experience, for those of us who are romantically inclined anyway. But if gay guys are talking about love and romance, I'm not going to feel represented by that. Even when white women talk about love and romance, there are some discrepancies between the way that I view it and they view it, but that's just a natural part of like being alive and understanding that just because something doesn't cater towards your specific proclivities, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's hostile. And to treat everything that...
But when every single thing in society is catering towards people who experience romantic attraction, and there is no recognition that anybody might not feel that way, that's where the problem lies. Not that some people talk about being romantically attracted to other people, not that there's some media about people in romantic relationships, but that there is no discussion of people who are otherwise. And it's the same exact thing of why there's gay pride, why there's queer spaces, is to have a place where there's a recognition of people who fall outside of the cisgender heterosexual norm. It's the exact same thing. You don't need everything to cater to you, but the problem is that there's nothing.
If someone was gonna like ask me to introduce myself, I would, I'd say my name is Jake. I'm a music producer, like whatever. The leading.
My name is Jake, and I'm here to say.
Well, no. Like the leading thing for me is like what I'm passionate and what I'm trying to excel at. That's kind of like what I identify as, if you know what I mean. Like that's what I'm striving to identify as. But for like a lot of people, it feels like, and for me, largely that decision comes from the fact that who cares what I put my dick in or what or what any of the rest of it. So I mean, if you feel the need to kind of pronounce that before anything else, to me it kind of feels like you feel like that's interesting to people.
First of all, I don't think that in most cases, in most places, aromantic people would go up to somebody and say like, "Hello, my name is Dave and I am aromantic." As an asexual person, in most spaces, that's not how I introduce myself. I introduce myself as a writer or a scientist or a medical student. But again, there's also some places where that would be appropriate, like in queer spaces where the focus is on non-normative identities. In some places like that would be appropriate to go up to somebody and be like, yeah, hi, I'm Jamie, I'm asexual, or like, hi, I'm Claire, I'm aromantic. That sort of thing, what identities you put first is a lot of times a function of the space that you're in and what is relevant to the social situation. And you can't really make a prescriptive statement one way or the other about like what's the right thing to highlight as your identity. And the fact that you wouldn't highlight being aromantic, just like the fact that you in some places wouldn't highlight that you're gay or wouldn't highlight that you're trans, doesn't make it not a real thing. It just means that in some places what's relevant about you as a person is not that. I think that what they're getting at is like aromantic people, like that's the only or that's the biggest part of their identity, which again is such a tired argument for any like that's used against any queer identity, that like, oh, that's the biggest, that's the only part of their identity, when that's just a straw man and completely not true.
And that's the thing the thing is like with whiteness and maleness and heterosexuality and all of those things, because those things are hegemonic, they're sort of invisible in that sense. Whereas with people who come from these identity categories, they don't want that. That's what I want. I always tell people, like, I want to treat me like you would treat a fucking white dude. But it seems as if that's not the invisibility that that hegemony gets one isn't something that they want to aspire to. They want to basically have their identity category have as much primacy and power based upon the signifiers. And that seems pretty reductive.
So
there are people who feel like if they have a minoritized identity, they want as much as possible for that minoritized identity to be made less visible as a part of their identity. Like she said, treat me like a white dude. Whereas a lot of people push back against that and are like, no, I like this part about me. I want it to be celebrated. I want it to be made visible. I don't want to hide it. You know, like Black people in the natural hair movement. Like, I don't want them saying, I don't want my hair to look like a white person's hair. I want to celebrate what my hair looks like in its natural state. Or trans people being like reclaiming the idea that like I want to celebrate that I'm trans. I want to celebrate this part of my identity and not hide it, not try to, you know, completely be in the closet and have everybody just treat me like a cis person. And I think that it plays into the idea that being white and cisgender and male and romantically and sexually inclined are the norm, and that anything other than that should be de-emphasized and treated like that norm. And I personally don't agree with that.
And it's also the thing is, it's like, even if you were gay, it's not something you would need to announce in that situation. Or like, do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's just like,
if you're in a group of filmmakers, if you're in a group of like writers and you're introducing yourself, I guess it depends on your comfort level and the context, whether or not you would divulge something about your identity, like being gay or being aromantic. In some cases that might be appropriate. In some social situations you might not mention it right away.
Like, that's the thing, is like, this is really something that can only exist and sustain itself within the sort of artificial realm of the internet, in my opinion, because in real life when people get together, it's typically not around things like what's your sexuality, unless you're going to a specific place that's designated for those things. When you're in normal environments like the workplace or school or the, you know, your office environment or any of these other places, you're usually together with other people around shared, you know, issues or work or whatever, picking up children. So it would be very unsettling and strange if someone tried to bring their identity to like the forefront of that.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first of all, yes, in real life, this is not just a thing that exists on the internet, and in real life there are situations where you are gathering with other people based around your romantic or sexual identity, i.e., queer spaces, going to anything that's a gathering specifically for LGBTQ plus people. The workplace, like, again, like, I feel like it all depends on what kind of rapport you have with people, what your relationship is with them. At some point, it might come up, and I don't think that that's weird.
Is it not like basically sexual harassment to be at work and go, so, who do you like to fuck?
Yeah.
Is that not that's basically sexual harassment, if I'm not mistaken. Like, you could probably get fired for that.
Yeah. Or it would be like, oh, here's who I like to fuck. Like,
yeah,
you know.
That's also sexual harassment.
Yeah, but I actually have experienced that before. And
that's also such a weird way of putting it. Like, do they think of being gay as just talking about who you like to fuck? That's completely different than saying, like, you know, meeting a new coworker, and if you decide to do this, saying, like, hi, I'm Sean, I'm gay. Like, that's not, you're not expressing to that person anything explicit about your sex life. You're not explicitly telling them, like, yeah, I banged this dude last night, right? You're saying, I am gay, I am romantically and sexually attracted to guys, but, like, I don't see a problem with saying that, and so I don't see a problem with saying to a coworker, if you choose to do so, like, I'm aromantic. It all depends on the context, and it's weird to me that they see these, like, sexual orientations as just who you like to fuck.
At one of these sort of weird lefty events, I'm not going to go into detail about who or where it was, but this person started going into sort of grave detail about a certain aspect of their sex life or proclivity. And when I reacted with, like, normal kind of, like, I don't want to hear that kind of thing, they almost looked at me as if I was bigoted for not being super, like, intently interested.
Okay, you should not talk about explicit details about sex or your sex life unless people have consented to hear about that. So this person was just out of bounds, not for any reason about them talking about their identity, but just because they were talking about explicit sexual topics without getting consent.
If someone said that, like, you know, oh, you know, my name's whatever, and I've got a persona that I inhabit on the weekends, that's when I'm just like, well, I don't know how much more conversations we're going to have before I'm just weirded out by you, because that's always going to be in the back of my mind that you're, you know.
I think that says a lot more about him than it says about the person who said that they have a persona or that they're a furry. That, like, once you hear this one thing that doesn't jive with what you consider to be a normal hobby, that's all you're going to think about, is you're going to picture that person as a furry and as nothing else for the rest of the time that you interact with them. That's just telling on yourself.
And it's an all-encompassing dimension of, like, the personality that they're trying to sort of superimpose to cover whatever insecurities or anxieties about not really being that interesting that they're trying to have in real life, which is oftentimes what it is. People who really just aren't that interesting, who take these sort of different identitarian categories and amplify them to absurd degrees, and it ends up harming whatever community it is that they claim to speak for or be the face of.
And the thing is...
No. How does people being aromantic or asexual or whatever other identities that these people would consider not valid harmful to, I assume, the LGBTQ community is what they're going for? How?
When people say, like, well, it's not hegemonic, just give it some room, let it have its time. And it's like, no, I don't think you understand what's going on here. You're not taking on the hegemony with this thing. You're trying to create a new inclusive hegemony that includes this thing in a very essentialized, very narrow version of it that can be easily commodified, spread around, advocated for. And it's never about, like, this sort of wide breadth of experience that is possible. It's never about the fact that, like, there are actual, like, exceptions in human sexuality. There are variants. It's never about that. Like, when people talk about non-binary, for instance, they always essentialize it as a third gender. It's like a thing where you dress a certain way. You dress, you say certain things. You act a certain way. There is a definite move to do that. And because it creates a version of the thing that it kind of enforces on everybody who might be labeled as that thing.
But
Okay. I think maybe this is getting at the crux of the issue, is that are conflating anybody who identifies as aromantic with the push that happens under capitalism to turn something into a marketable identity that they can then sell things or a lifestyle to. And I think that's what they're getting at with bringing it around to talking about people being non-binary. And I am also non-binary. This is a thing that Peter and I have in common. And yeah, there is, since it's become more recognized, there is a push to turn it into this androgynous boy light kind of identity that, like Peter was saying, is treated as a third gender as opposed to a rejection of gender norms or an umbrella of genders that fall anywhere on or outside of the spectrum between what society calls being a man and being a woman, right? There is a push to make it into this singular commodified thing, but that doesn't mean that all non-binary people are viewing themselves that way and are specifically buying into their identity as a commodity. Similarly, with aromantic people, I think that they're getting confused, the push to make asexuality and aromanticism a commodity, with people's actual identity as not experiencing romantic attraction. The two are very different.
It's because they want to create it and codify these different things, these different proclivities as a separate category of being, something that distinguishes you from the rest of humanity, basically. And the thing is, with aromanticism, there's no such thing as an aromantic archetypal person. There may be people who are aromantic for a
Right, and there's no such thing as a gay archetypal person. There's no such thing as a trans archetypal person. There's no such thing as a non-binary archetypal person. Where are you going with this?
Plethora of different sorts of psychological issues. There are
oh no.
Loads of different types of people who aromantic feelings are just sort of a part of their psychological makeup. And maybe there are also people who don't have any of those issues but are also aromantic, but the idea that it's sort of a separate category of being, or that
imagine somebody who has been in relationships, who's just tired of being in relationships, has been burned heavily over time. I feel like that is a perfectly valid thing to have. All of these things, a lot of these.
Okay, choosing not to pursue romantic relationships because you have had bad experiences in romantic relationships is not the same as not experiencing romantic attraction. I feel like they're getting that confused because it's not a choice. And yes, there are people who have had bad experiences in romantic relationships and then chosen not to pursue any more romantic relationships. And this is not the same. This is okay, so my grandpa is obviously older. He's a white dude, very conservative. And he has said at multiple instances that he thinks that the reason why women become lesbians is because they've had bad experiences with men. And this statement is, this false equivalence is just as ridiculous as what my grandpa thinks. Because it's not, people being lesbians is not because they had a bad experience with men. People being aromantic is not because they had bad experiences with romantic relationships. It's because they there's a type of attraction and they don't experience it.
Things but they're not an identity.
No.
They aren't the essence of a person.
No,
they
it's
aren't
a phenomena.
a whole breadth of a human being.
Exactly.
It is literally just a one. And let's just be clear, a tiny aspect of that person, because again, it is the absence of a specific element of the human experience that everybody else might have a lot more to say. If you have something to say about being aromantic, it would be oh, I'm not in a relationship and that's how I prefer it. Why?
That's, again, preferring not to be in a relationship is not automatically the same as not experiencing romantic attraction. The two might overlap, but they're not the same thing.
Well, I don't like it. Like, you know.
There are a plethora of reasons. Some could be like someone who's been burned multiple times. You could be dealing with somebody who's on the fucking antisocial spectrum in terms of like narcissism, sociopathy, loads of different things. Or it could be somebody who just doesn't have any sort of inclination or interest towards that kind of thing.
Okay. Of those three things, the first one is what I was talking about before. Like, some people might choose not to enter more romantic relationships because of a bad experience. The second one is a psychiatric disorder, and that is a topic for a different video. And the third one is being aromantic. These are three different the same end experience of not being in a romantic relationship and not wanting to be in one for three different reasons. Only one category of those people who are not in a romantic relationship are aromantic. The other two have other reasons for not being in a romantic relationship.
The part of me wants to, you know, be very kind and say that people trying to cultivate the demographic of aromantic is legitimate. A part of me feels that, you know, the cynical part of my belly that's got that gut feeling kind of makes me feel like it's the incels of all genders trying to rebrand themselves as something not toxic and fucking
Oh my god. No, absolutely not. Okay, like I have seen this in a couple of places of people comparing like asexual people to incels, or aromantic people, I guess in this instance, to incels. No. Again, to go back to our categories of the end instance of a person not being in a romantic relationship and not wanting to be in one, incels don't even fall into that category. They're not in a romantic relationship, but they want to be in one. Whereas the other instances we were talking about, people who've had bad experiences, people who have some kind of mental health condition, and aromantic people don't fall under that category at all, because they fundamentally don't want to be in a romantic relationship for whatever reason, as opposed to incels who, again, do.
I think there's a lot to that. I do think that there's a lot to that. I think the incel actually has more of a legitimate grievance than this, though, because they literally are talking about not being able to do something that they want to do.
Even then, I don't even agree that the incels have like a legitimate grievance, because
I'm just saying compared to this.
Not being able...
Compared to people who don't want to be in a romantic relationship but are constantly told that they should, the people who are creepy and predatory towards women and think that they are owed a romantic relationship have a point. Is that what you're saying, Peter?
But yeah, it's again the same thing of, you're not allowed to look at any of the psychological reasons why this category exists or why people would feel this way. And that's not to say everybody who feels this way has some kind of psychological thing going on, but to say that everybody who feels this way is a separate category of being and they don't have any psychological issues. No, they're all aromantic and they're all valid. And if you say anything different from that, then you're this awful bigot. Like, if somebody who's been burned a lot of times and has had a lot of trauma around relationships, that's somebody who needs support. That's not somebody who should then take on a narcissistic identity around being aromantic and then have everybody validate it. I feel like that is doing that person so much more harm than it is helping. But it seems as if the culture is kind of encouraging people not to excavate the reasons why they may be having this feeling. They're just saying it's valid, it's a fucking identity, and anyone who questions that is bullshit.
There is all the...
Again, we're back to the same issue of conflating people who've had bad experiences in relationships with aromantic people who don't experience romantic attraction. But to say that that's an unhealthy response is incredibly disingenuous and awful.
People who get wound up into these things, but there's also a segment of people in power, like people who might own a social platform, where these people might do advocacy on their own behalf, or people who might be at the head of some NGO or advocacy group or something, who might have an incentive to kind of, and I really feel like that is present here in a lot of these identities, including totally, like, entirely valid identities in which that I wouldn't even make these types of criticisms towards.
It's even...
Yeah, so again, I think that they are getting themselves twisted up in knots. Because there is one problem of corporations profiting off of people's identities, and we're coming up on Pride Month, which means all of the corporations are slapping rainbows on everything and saying that they're allies to the LGBTQ community. That is a separate issue entirely from, are these identities valid? There's the profit, which is disingenuous and often pushed on people who spend a lot of time online and marketed to people based off of Google algorithms and whatnot. And there might be people who are more likely to buy a whole bunch of like rainbow plastered products for whatever reason. And then there's like the actual identities themselves. And I think that Peter and the other people on this podcast are getting mixed up. The marketing, which again, exploitative, bad. I hate it when companies are like, oh, we're allies, we have a rainbow, buy our stuff. And identity.
It's almost always co-signed by the power structure. It's almost always
exactly.
It's always given like the go-ahead. Okay, that's right. You are born that way, and you can never change away from that, which is, by the way, bigotry. But you are those things, and that's what makes you special. And that's what makes all of those other people bad, because they don't like you. They don't like you for who you are internally, the way you were born. They hate you. They want you not to be that. Here's a flag.
Yep. But the truth of the matter is most people are indifferent and don't care. But these people, they perceive indifference as hostility.
Oh, no, I don't think that they perceive indifference as hostility. If somebody were just like reacted to you saying like, oh, I'm aromantic and also aromantic people exists, and you said, okay, cool. Or even if this was like a social media post and you just didn't interact, nobody would really have a problem with that. But if you respond to that social media post or the video, which is where this is all coming from, by saying this isn't a real thing and you're being narcissistic and you might have mental health issues, again, that's being bigoted. That's not indifference. That's actively going out of your way to mock and belittle a group of people.
The people that fucking stick with you, the people that stick in my memory, and the people that stick in your life as well a lot of the time, I feel like, are the people that can fucking tell a good story, mate, that have had experiences, have lived a bit of life. And you're interested to hear that life. You're interested to hear that different experience.
Sometimes that does, when it comes up, when it's appropriate, it will evolve elements of people's identity and experience. And isn't that what tolerance is about? It's not something you browbeat people with over the head. Like, get to know me first, for fuck's sake. Like, buy me fucking dinner first. Like, smooth the wheels a little bit. But it seems as if people want to just come out forefront strong. This is my identity. This is how you respect it. And I don't see how that breeds anything but like derision and hostility. It's just like,
again, okay, so this is going back to what I think a lot of homophobic people's reaction to Pride is seeing an event that is meant to celebrate a person's identity and thinking that's their entire identity. These people on this podcast saw a video that was meant to be educational about aromantic people and have extrapolated that that must be not only just that person's entire identity, but all aromantic people's entire identity is telling you that you're aromantic. I think they're completely strawmanning because, like they said, like, first of all, this dude was like, oh, I like people that can tell a good story that have had experiences. Do you think that no aromantic people have experiences that would make interesting stories? And then they went on to say, like, yeah, and your identity comes into some of those stories. Exactly. It would probably most naturally come up as a part of somebody relaying their experience to say that they're aromantic in the context of, like, oh, this guy in college was trying to ask me out and he was being really persistent, and eventually I told him that, like, I'm aromantic, I'm not interested, and then he did, like, either it's a funny story like, oh, now we're friends, or he was a douche and did something really awful about it. Like, that's how it would naturally come up. right?
permeate.
Can you imagine coming out to your parents as aromantic?
No, but I can understand that, because there may be some people who came out to their parents as aromantic, and their parents had genuine concerns because their parents, want their child to have a partner and to have company in life, and or to have children.
Totally.
A lot of the time.
You are being very bigoted, Angie.
Do you want me to do my impression of Angie's mum reacting to her telling her that she's aromantic?
Oh my God, yes, very much.
Aromantic, eh? What is this aromantic? What about my grandchildren? Huh? Angela, you can't do this to me. Why do you want to curse me? Why do you want to curse me with no grandchildren?
Your Nigerian accent is...
I don't know why they think this is funny or why this is an argument against aromantic people existing. This is a thing that happens when aromantic and asexual people come out to their parents. And it tracks with a lot of what happens when gay people or trans people come out to their parents, is that, they say the thing about, like, well, now you're not going to have children, and they make it about themselves and about how they want grandchildren, or like, you're going to be alone, misunderstanding that you can have other kinds of meaningful relationships in your life. Like, I had that happen when I came out as asexual to my parents, and they thought that it was sad that I was going to be alone for the rest of my life, and I was like, no, I mean, aside from maybe wanting to be in a romantic relationship, like, I have lots of fulfilling friendships that make me very happy. But yes, this is a thing that parents say because they don't understand when their kid comes out as aromantic, and it can be very distressing to the kid. And I think they're going to get into this in a second, but the parents might also want to take their kid to seek medical help, which is not going to help in most cases, because it's not a medical disorder.
But back to the whole, like, aromantic family thing, like, yeah, there's a certain amount of societal discomfort and misunderstanding that you're going to experience as somebody who's doing something that's not hegemonic. Like,
but is it going to harm you materially? That's really what I'm getting at. I don't think so.
No, they say that one of the things that they say is that, having two people have an income is, better than one, and that's not fair. And it's like, well, that's the system. That's a systemic issue that all of us suffer from. Like, there are a lot of single people who are not aromantic that don't benefit from having two incomes.
There's this thing called being poor too. Like, you could work towards solving that issue. It would solve this problem for more than just like aromantic
single
people.
Mothers.
It would solve the problem for immigrants. It would solve the problem for gay people.
Is it that you get to a certain stage in your life when you, quote unquote, should be in a
I don't think that anybody is saying that this is specifically a problem just for aromantic people, and therefore we should solve it just for aromantic people. It is a systemic problem, as they pointed out, and it requires a systemic solution that would solve the problem for aromantic people and poor people and, like, single parents and immigrants, and, like, that's the definition of a systemic problem. And when people are fighting for changes to that system, it's almost never just because of their specific identity group, if it's something that affects lots of people. It's because it's just a bad system that's called capitalism. The solution, again, to this systemic problem of people not being able to survive on one income is to systemically increase people's income, either by raising the minimum wage or by abolishing capitalism and just making sure that everybody has the amount that they need to live. Like, this is not something that's specific to aromantic people, but aromantic people, among others, advocate for solutions to this because it's something that affects them and other people.
I think that it is important that an actual, like, class-focused set of, like, people who want to actually get something done do sit down and say, listen, this is not what we are talking about.
Yes, exactly. Which is why we do what we do, because it's important to be able to dispel and demystify bourgeois ideology, which is precisely what's being used to prevent these sorts of broader conversations from happening. It's sort of being obfuscated and like used as a tool.
Yeah, I hear people like,
okay, again, I think that they're getting the exploitation of these identities by capital confused with the identities themselves. Clearly, being aromantic is not a bourgeois thing. It doesn't differentiate by class. It doesn't really have anything to do with class. But some of the things that aromantic people might advocate for would actually, like they were saying, help people who are poor and working class. So I don't know what their problem is. But this is fundamentally a different thing from capital and the media using these identities to distract from class-based issues. Separate out those two issues. If this whole podcast had been about how capital uses identity groups of any kind to like disrupt the working class and divide the working class, that's the word I was looking for, and make progress for everybody less viable, that would have been a great podcast, I think. But this was like picking on one particular identity group and saying that like this group specifically is in combination with capital responsible for why we can't talk about class-based issues. Like, I don't get it. It's such a bad argument. Like, it's just a bad argument. Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of they've sort of run through the whole docket of common and also not so common arguments about why being aromantic is not a valid identity. They've hit all of the check boxes for, saying that people are mentally ill, saying that they're narcissistic, saying that they should go to a doctor. And I hope that what you all have taken away from this is that these are not really valid arguments, and that I think, first and foremost, from a leftist perspective, there is a difference between the commodification of identities, which happens to all identities as a way to divide the working class and make a profit, is different from those identities. And above all else, minoritized people should have solidarity with one another against this capitalist class, which is something that, unfortunately, I think that they've missed out on that fundamental analysis in this podcast. But anyway, that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.